Michael Bociurkiw is here with me for more. And what I heard, Michael, a minute in or so, is that the West, from Putin, the West did not want to listen to Russia. They had other plans. And he kind of hinted there at the fact that the West turned down Russia's proposed security guarantees, talking obviously about NATO. What stood out to you?
Well, I don't know if you had the same reaction at the end, but okay, so what next? There was very, very little indication of where things are going to go from here. That could indicate one of two things. I think they don't know yet which direction they will take to escalate or tone things down. Or on the chilling side of the spectrum is we're going to go all out. But yes, very much projecting Russia as the victim, accusing the West and NATO of international terrorism, Western aggression, and again, referring to Ukrainians in that insulting way of neo-Nazis and Nazis. The other quick thing is I'm now seeing he's not distinguishing between the Russian-backed rebels in the Donbass and the Russian armed forces. So that is kind of behind-the-scenes acknowledgement that our men are also serving there.
And for so long, of course, we have been talking about the fact that perhaps Putin would announce, declare officially war in Ukraine. There was didn't know what the word war didn't appear in his speech from what I heard, and if you heard it, but he continued to call it a special military operation. And he said the special military operation, I'm going to quote him, one needed and timely measure. It was the only right decision, really, for winning and winning. He said, what did he say, for land, including Crimea? He said he talked about the volunteers. But where does this go? Because if this is still very much a special military operation, are we expecting here a continuation of what we have seen for the last 70-plus days?
No sign of backing down. That's the chilling point here. The other thing is he referred to deaths on the Russian side, but no mention of numbers. He thanked nurses and NGOs and so on. But I think I think we're going to see perhaps a shift because they're not doing well, as you and I have spoken on the battlefield. So more of a reliance on artillery, those long-range rockets. And that's a chilling scenario because of the fact that they tend to strike heavily populated civilian infrastructure. They have no qualms about that.
I want to bring in our Nick Robertson for more of what his takeaway. But Nick, I don't know if you were hearing his speech, but he said that NATO was plotting to attack Russia through Ukraine, and he said that the special military operation was needed because West did not want to listen to Russia. They had other plans, is what he said.
Yeah, it's a reinvigoration of a message that he was leading out with in the run-up to this war, and it amplifies it on a very big stage here, the moment and the place that the world was going to listen to President Putin to see what his intent was on Ukraine. I was struck by the way that he referred, at least to the battle zone, if you will, as Donbass rather than the whole of Ukraine. And I was struck, and I think perhaps we need to go back and recheck translations. But he did, from my recollection of what I was listening to, make the point that some of the soldiers and officers there on Red Square had come, and the words that I heard were from Donbass, and the words President Putin used, from the theater of war, which, as you noted, would be a difference in rhetoric from a special military operation. That these people, the soldiers there, were fighting for the motherland, and particularly to the point that you've been discussing earlier, that Putin particularly pulls his forces and troops in from some of the remoter and poorer regions of Russia, talking about everyone from the different ethnic backgrounds all fighting together for the motherland. These were some of the things that struck me, aside from the obvious fact that there was little there to read into how he plans to go forward. No sense at all of backing down, however.
Yeah, and you are quite right. And as you were talking, Nick, Michael Bociurkiw and I were both nodding in agreement to what we heard. I jotted down as well him thanking the Donbass volunteers and the Russian troops for fighting for the motherland. The question now is, Nick, what can we expect? How does that translate, perhaps his words translate to the battlefield here, to the front lines in the east of the country?
I think it does give him the ability to have or not have the success that he wanted to have, that his ultimate achievement may be to secure a slightly larger territory within the Donbass, and maybe not even within the whole sort of geographically, politically demarked oblast of Luhansk and Donetsk of Donbass. That he may be able to frame this ultimately as that's what he set out, because he wasn't sort of framing in any way bigger gains other than, again, just the Donbass was the area he was talking about. So I think it gives him that opportunity, and it gives him the ambiguity to reach further and longer that we know was his original intent, and that he clearly hasn't given up on yet. But it must be becoming apparent to him, as it is to everyone else, that his ground effects have so far been limited, and to stretch towards Odessa and along the Black Sea coast as he originally appears to have intended. At the moment, that's a stretch that he can't manage. So I think there's ambiguity there that allows him to scale back original objectives into a manageable cell at the end of what may be yet an even more costly conflict for him.
And meanwhile, Nick, we did hear from the G7. They had a virtual meeting yesterday. The timing, of course, important given what we're seeing on our screen right now. What was the message from the G7, knowing that this was coming, perhaps?
That the international community, the G7 nations, continue to stand behind Ukraine in terms of its immediate military needs, in terms of its immediate financial needs to run the country, but its longer-term needs to rebuild the territorial integrity and sovereignty that President Zelensky of Ukraine spoke to the G7 leaders about. That was endorsed. That's the language that we've heard all along, and that commitment remains. And I think that commitment is something that was intended to signal to President Putin that while nothing may have particularly changed in his mind about the conflict, the way that he understands it, in terms of the opposing forces, for President Putin at least, nothing has changed there, and that they'll continue to ramp up and continue to try to diminish President Putin's propaganda, the disinformation. That was one of the commitments from the G7, and also to throttle back energy imports with the aim of ending, as soon as it can be done in a timely way, oil imports from Russia. Again, this would be a financial hit for Putin.
Nick Robertson for us in Helsinki. Thanks very much, Nick. Michael Bociurkiw is with me now. And Michael, you know, you've seen many of these parades, no doubt, like I have. And often we see almost like an air show, don't we? An air parade, a portion like a Victory Day. This, apparently we're hearing, has been cancelled because of the weather. This coming from Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov. Looking at these images, it doesn't look like a very cloudy or rainy day, but we have been hearing from Dmitry Peskov, who the Kremlin spokesman, saying that the air portion of the Victory Parade in Moscow has been cancelled. But really, I want to pick up with what we were hearing from Nick there, putting everything into context, what we're hearing from the West and from the G7. The question now becomes, what happens on the front lines? He was focusing very much, didn't mention Kyiv, didn't mention Ukraine as a whole, he focused on Donbass.
Yeah. If I was a Western military planner, I'd be pretty dizzy right now because there are those lack of crucial cues as to what happens next. But yes, the focus on the Donbass, I mean, when they started, they only had about 30% of that whole region. They're having real problems getting a hold of key cities, Slavyansk, for example, which they held for a while before in 2014. Also Kramatorsk, which is very important militarily. Interesting that they did bring a senior Russian politician to Mariupol.
Just yesterday.
Yes, and that is a very, very brazen move. I'm sure it was spun back home to show that we have the ability to move about. But no, the fact that, you know, a few scattered clouds or whatever can chase away the Russian armed forces is not a very good sign. The way forward, of course, if you're a Western military planner or Ukrainian military planner, you would like those strong cues to know what they're going to do. But again, my fear is very much the Harvey artillery is going to be used instead of more ground troops.
It did sound a bit like, you know, we are defending the motherland,
Yes.
we're grateful, we are victims in all of this, but almost a cue for further mobilization of troops and a further push and intensity in the battlefield, which, by the way, we have been seeing. We have been seeing in the last few days in the Donbass region. We've seen it also, you mentioned Kramatorsk, Luhansk, with that school shelter being bombed. But the Ukrainians have been able to sustain, kind of we've seen the push and pull to sustain those attacks. The question, like you and I were talking about earlier, was how long can they sustain it? Because if this were going to go into a protracted war, then there are other challenges for President Zelensky here.
Exactly, and as much as the West likes to provide these high-tech weapons and get them into the hands of the Ukrainian army as soon as possible, we mustn't forget that human toll. You and I were talking earlier. I was at the Lychakovsky Cemetery yesterday, and it really brought home the human cost of the war. There's about 66 graves there right now since the beginning of the conflict from Lviv alone. They ran out of space inside the cemetery. Now they're putting graves outside. So this has to be remembered from Western leaders that, you know, as much as the Ukrainians are doing a great job, there is that human toll not only amongst military, but also huge civilian cost.
Michael Bociurkiw, I know you'll stay with us. Woman Scott McLean and Michael Bociurkiw are with me now. Michael, as you know, is a senior fellow at Atlantic Council with me for the last hour or 2 hours. I've lost track of time now. But thank you, Scott, for joining us. I want to get to really President Zelensky's message, because we've heard from President Putin. We've heard his message. What is President Zelensky saying?
Yeah, so much has been made about this May 9th victory in Europe Day, obviously celebrated on May 8th in the rest of Europe, but because of the time difference on that date in 1945, the Russians celebrated a day later. And of course, the Russians have been framing this entire war as a battle against the Nazification of Ukraine. That's the way that they're framing it. Obviously, there's many reasons that the Ukrainians feel that that is entirely ridiculous premise. And the thing that stood out to me about the video that President Zelensky had released is that he said that the enemy dreamed that we would refuse to celebrate May 9th and the victory over Nazism so that the word denazification gets a chance. And I think that's important here. And President Zelensky clearly tried to frame things as, look, this is not just a battle on the ground, not just a battle in war, but it is also a battle of two different worldviews. Listen.
This is not a war of two armies. This is a war of two worldviews. The war waged by barbarians who shell the Skovoroda Museum and believe that their missiles can destroy our philosophy. It annoys them. It is unfamiliar to them. It scares them. Its essence is that we are free people who have their own path. Today, we are waging war on this path, and we will not give anyone a single piece of our land.
Also, very defiant message from President Zelensky. And Michael, just for the viewers who are just joining us, who perhaps missed what President Putin had to say, give us a sense of what you took away from it.
Sure. Well, again, more rhetoric calling Ukrainians Nazis, that Russian Federation is the victim. It's NATO and Western allies that started this war, all part of that Russian narrative. But as you and I were talking, there was very little to signal. So what happens next? It's almost as if the speech ended very abruptly. So Western military planners, Ukrainian planners, are going to have a tough time trying to figure out. But my guess, if I can put it that way, would be that they're going to put more reliance on that heavy, very, very deadly artillery, and then back that up, seize more lands if they can, and then put in more men to occupy.
And on the Nazism front, I know you were both talking about this, and he talked about the beginnings, our duty to keep a memory of those who defeated Nazism, the fighting for security of our nation now. Let's listen back to exactly what he said.
Those who defeated the Nazis showed us an example of heroism for all eternity. This was a generation of victors, and we shall always look up to them. Glory to our great armed forces, for Russia, for victory.
He also, something that stood out to me, and I noted it down, he talked about a moral degradation. He continued to call it, Michael, a special military operation, but he talked about the moral degradation. What is the message for his home audience at home.
Well,
on
you
that.
know, that's very ironic and interesting because where do Russian leaders, those in Putin's very inner circle, like to send their kids for education? To the West. Where do Western oligarchs and politicians like to buy property? In the West, places like the United Kingdom. So that's why I've been talking for the longest time about we have to put more bite into these sanctions, stop issuing visas for education to his inner circle, and stop the sales of those luxury properties to Russian oligarchs and inner circle of Putin.
And Scott, at least I didn't hear the word war or, declaration of war. For weeks now, we've been talking about perhaps he may signal, he may officially call it a war. He's still calling it a special military operation, but he did focus on the Donbass, and that's important given what you and I and all the teams in the field have been seeing for now 70 plus days.
I honestly have no idea what we should take from this speech because, I mean, as Michael mentions, the West has been predicting that perhaps President Putin would seize on the symbolism of this day to declare war or to declare an escalation or to sort of rally the troops to push even harder or perhaps even oddly declare victory in some way. And I don't know, I just read back the transcript and I didn't hear any of this. And so I'm not really sure what to make of it, but you mentioned the fighting in the Donbass. And in Donetsk in particular is where some of the heaviest fighting is where we're seeing as the Russians are trying to sort of push through those Ukrainian front lines. And we know that when the Russians are having a difficult time on the ground, they tend to just bomb and shell everything in their path. And that's what we're seeing there.
And I'm just going to take a pause now because, of course, this is Victory Day. It's the Tomb of the Unknown. And this Victory Day is obviously the defeat of Nazi Germany during the Second World War. Let's just take a listen, please. From Moscow there, where President Putin there just laid a wreath at the Tomb of the Unknown. Of course, today is Victory Day in Russia. It's when Russia marks the defeat of Nazi Germany during the Second World War. And of course, it comes under the shadow of really a new war in Europe, an event that this year has taken new added significance. Michael Bociurkiw is with me, Scott McLean is with me now as we look at these live pictures coming in. And Michael, no doubt the irony not lost on the Ukrainians as, of course, President Putin, as he said in his speech, continues this special operation, military operation in Ukraine.
And dealing a heavy toll on Ukrainians, especially the civilian infrastructure. It's hard to come by the number of civilian deaths, but we do know that the number of children in that number is very high. The other thing, by the way, and I expected Mr. Putin perhaps to do a PR play out of this, is don't forget hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians forcibly deported into Russia. 500,000 according to the Ukrainians, as much as 1 million according to the Russians, often being taken to the Far East, to remote areas. I thought he might have said these people have been willingly volunteered to go, but I'm very, very worried about their fate as well, because to the Ukrainian kind of psyche, including my parents, they were born from here, is of course memories of the Gulag and of people being tortured, of the church, other institutions being liquidated. So this the stealing of grain brings back memories of the Holodomor, of the famine of 32, 33. So a lot of the rhetoric, but a lot of the Russian actions are just absolutely horrifying to Ukrainians here.
Yeah.